In the halls of the German High Command, confidence ran deep. Hitler and his generals believed the United States was a nation of dreamers, incapable of transforming its factories into instruments of war. They laughed at the idea that America could produce planes fast enough to challenge the Luftwaffe. Hitler himself mocked the notion, calling American industry slow, soft, and untested. He thought the skies over Germany would remain under his control, that every American bomber shot down was a victory that would eventually cripple the enemy. But this arrogance would prove to be one of the gravest miscalculations of the entire war. The German leadership had underestimated not just the raw production power of the United States, but the sheer determination of a nation at war. They believed attrition would be enough, that their experienced pilots and advanced aircraft would wear down the American bombing campaigns, and that the U.S. would run out of planes before Germany did. They could not have been more wrong. The first bomber raids over Germany in 1943 were intended to test the limits of the Luftwaffe. American aircraft, primarily B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, began striking industrial targets, oil refineries, and transportation hubs deep inside the Reich. At first, the Germans took pride in their ability to intercept these intruders. Fighter squadrons scrambled with precision, and anti-aircraft guns filled the skies with lethal flak. Losses on both sides were significant, but German pilots and strategists interpreted these early successes as confirmation of their assumptions. Every downed bomber was seen as proof that the Americans were overextended, that their industrial base could not possibly sustain such losses. Hitler, confident in his judgment, doubled down on this belief. He assumed the U.S. would tire, that the flow of bombers would slow, and that Germany could gradually grind the Allied air forces down into submission. In private meetings, high-ranking officers nodded in agreement, their reports reinforcing the illusion that victory was within reach. The German military elite, blinded by arrogance and hubris, could not see the storm that was quietly gathering on the other side of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a quiet revolution was taking place. American factories, many of them converted from civilian production lines, were operating at a pace that stunned even their own planners. Thousands of workers, men and women alike, labored day and night. New techniques in assembly line production, pioneered during the Great Depression and refined for wartime efficiency, allowed aircraft to roll off the lines faster than the Luftwaffe could track. Every week, dozens of B-17s and B-24s were delivered to air bases in England, ready to join bombing missions over German territory. The United States was not just replacing lost aircraft, it was expanding the fleet at an unprecedented rate. Yet the Germans remained unaware. Hitler and his generals still believed that attrition would eventually turn the tide in their favor. The very assumption that American production had limits was about to become their undoing. As German officers plotted air defense strategies and celebrated every bomber they shot down, an invisible tide of new bombers was forming, an unstoppable wave that would not stop until the heart of the Reich itself was under relentless attack. What the Germans could not comprehend was the scale and speed of American industrial mobilization. Every airplane destroyed by German fighters was replaced within days, often with a more advanced model, and supported by a growing network of trained crews. The U.S. was learning quickly, adapting tactics, improving aircraft, and increasing the production of essential components like engines, bombs, and navigational equipment. While German intelligence remained convinced they had the advantage, the Americans quietly built a system that made losses irrelevant. The bomber program became a symbol of this industrial might, relentless, precise, and seemingly inexhaustible. Hitler's mockery of American industry, once confident and dismissive, was about to collide with a reality far beyond his imagination. The stage was set for a conflict not just in the skies, but between two vastly different visions of war, one fueled by arrogance and overconfidence, the other by discipline, innovation, and unyielding production power. The war in the air was about to reach a point where Germany's best pilots and most advanced planes could no longer keep up. The consequences of this miscalculation would be devastating. By the spring of 1943, the German High Command had become increasingly confident in its predictions. Hitler and his generals viewed the United States as a distant, untested industrial nation, naive in the ways of modern warfare. They assumed that, while America might have factories and resources, it lacked the discipline, experience, and organizational rigor required to sustain a true war effort. German leaders frequently dismissed reports of American production as exaggerated or impossible. In the memoirs of Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, he described conversations with military officials who laughed at the idea that the U.S. could maintain a steady supply of aircraft under the relentless pressure of combat. "They cannot keep up," one general reportedly said. "Every plane they lose is one too many." The Luftwaffe, proud and battle-hardened from campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, shared this confidence. Its pilots were among the best in the world, and its aircraft were technologically advanced. German officers believed that attrition alone would break the American air offensive, and they planned strategies around the assumption that U.S. bomber fleets would eventually dwindle to manageable numbers. The irony of this underestimation is stark. The Germans had witnessed the United States mobilize for war with astonishing speed. By 1942, factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and household appliances were transformed into sprawling aircraft production lines. Yet German intelligence failed to grasp the scale and efficiency of this industrial shift. Reports trickled in that the U.S. could produce hundreds of bombers each month, but the information was dismissed as propaganda or worst-case exaggeration. Hitler, ever confident in his intuition, relied on his personal beliefs rather than verified data. He assumed the Americans were slow, methodical, and easily fatigued. In meetings with his staff, he reportedly scoffed at suggestions that American output could match or exceed German losses. "Their factories are soft," he claimed. "They will crumble before the Luftwaffe." This dismissal of the enemy's capabilities would shape German strategy in ways that proved catastrophic. Every bomber the Luftwaffe shot down was perceived as a step closer to victory, while in reality, the Americans were already producing replacements at a pace that made German successes increasingly irrelevant. The Luftwaffe's early operations over Europe reinforced this dangerous illusion. German pilots intercepted bomber formations with precision, shooting down dozens of B-17s and B-24s during the initial raids. Commanders eagerly reported these victories, confident that the Americans could not sustain such losses. Within German circles, there was a prevailing sense of superiority. Elite fighter units, experienced from years of combat on multiple fronts, were considered invincible. Radar networks and anti-aircraft batteries provided layers of defense, further feeding the belief that the skies over Germany were secure. Yet beneath this confidence, a subtle but deadly error was taking root. The Germans were measuring success by the wrong metric. They focused on how many bombers were destroyed, not on how many were being built and sent back into combat. This failure to understand the enemy's production capabilities would soon turn what seemed like German dominance into a nightmare of attrition, fatigue, and mounting desperation. Speer later reflected on this underestimation with a sense of grim inevitability. He wrote that German leaders consistently failed to account for the industrial heart of the United States, a nation that combined technological skill with unprecedented manpower. Factories were running around the clock, with innovations in assembly line production that allowed planes to be completed in weeks rather than months. Every American bomber lost in the skies over Europe was quickly replaced by a new, often more advanced aircraft. Yet the Germans clung to outdated assumptions, convinced that the tide would turn in their favor. This arrogance blinded them to the reality unfolding across the Atlantic. By the time German intelligence began to recognize the scale of American production, it was already too late. The Luftwaffe faced a foe that could absorb losses, learn from mistakes, and continue striking with relentless force. What Hitler had mocked as slow and inefficient was actually a war machine capable of overwhelming even the most sophisticated defenses, and the consequences for Germany would be catastrophic. By mid-1943, the United States Army Air Forces had gained a foothold in England, and the first waves of long-range bombers were preparing to strike deep into the heart of Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, symbols of American industrial might, lifted off from hastily constructed airfields, loaded with bombs and filled with young crews who had trained for months in preparation for these perilous missions. Across the channel, German radar stations picked up the formations, and the Luftwaffe scrambled its fighter wings. On paper, Germany appeared ready for the challenge. Experienced pilots, superior aircraft in many respects, and a network of anti-aircraft guns provided layers of protection. Yet what unfolded in those early raids would begin to reveal a flaw in German calculations, a flaw that would widen into a chasm as the war continued. The initial raids targeted industrial centers such as the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, aircraft plants in Regensburg, and the steel mills of the Ruhr. These were carefully chosen to cripple German war production, and the Americans flew in tight formations to maximize defensive firepower. At first, the Luftwaffe met them with success. German pilots intercepted the bombers over occupied France and the Low Countries, shooting down dozens of aircraft. Flak batteries rained explosive shells into the sky, and the sound of exploding bombers filled the horizon. For the German command, these early victories were thrilling. Reports to Hitler emphasized the high number of American losses, reinforcing the belief that the Luftwaffe could maintain air superiority indefinitely. Hitler, confident in the strength of his air force, continued to mock the American industrial effort, assuming that attrition would slowly grind down the U.S. bombing campaign. Each downed bomber was celebrated, each American casualty catalogued as proof that Germany's defenses were unassailable. Yet beneath the surface of these tactical successes, the Americans were quietly undermining the German assumptions. Every bomber lost was replaced within weeks by a new aircraft, and crews were quickly trained to fill the ranks. The U.S. factories, running at full capacity, were churning out planes faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Even as German pilots claimed victory in the skies, the Americans were preparing the next wave, often with improved formations, better defensive strategies, and refined bombing techniques. The Germans measured success in isolated battles, focusing on how many planes they had shot down during a single mission, while the Americans measured success in the continuous pressure they applied to the German war machine. This difference in perspective would prove critical. The Germans celebrated their tactical wins, but they were unaware of the strategic reality. The United States could, and would, replace its losses relentlessly. The early raids were a taste of what was to come, and Germany's overconfidence blinded them to the true threat. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg missions in August 1943 provided a stark example of this emerging imbalance. In these raids, hundreds of American bombers penetrated deep into German airspace, facing intense fighter opposition and flak defenses. The Luftwaffe inflicted heavy losses, shooting down scores of bombers. On the surface, the numbers seemed favorable for Germany, but the Americans continued their relentless production and training. Within days, new bombers replaced those lost, and crews returned to the fight with renewed determination. The German pilots, exhausted and facing ever-increasing odds, began to realize that the American bombers were not only surviving but multiplying. The psychological impact was significant, victories felt fleeting, and each successful interception became a reminder that the enemy had no intention of stopping. Hitler's arrogance, reinforced by early success, was beginning to meet a reality that even his generals could not ignore. The United States was building an air arm that was virtually inexhaustible. Meanwhile, American air strategy was evolving. Formation flying, precision bombing techniques, and the development of fighter escorts like the P-47 Thunderbolt, and later the P-51 Mustang increased the effectiveness of the raids. Each mission taught the Americans lessons about German defenses, which were rapidly incorporated into future operations. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had finite resources and could not easily replace experienced pilots. Attrition began to take a toll not only on aircraft numbers but on the morale and stamina of German forces. The early bombing raids, initially seen as victories for Germany, were in fact the opening act of a much larger and more devastating campaign. For every bomber shot down, two more would take its place, and the realization that this tide could not be stopped was slowly sinking into the minds of German commanders. The stage was set for a war of endurance, one in which industrial capacity, not tactical skill alone, would decide the outcome. The first raids were only the beginning, and the Americans had barely begun to show the full extent of their power. While the Luftwaffe celebrated early victories over American bombers, a quiet revolution was taking place across the Atlantic. In the factories of the United States, an industrial miracle was underway, one that the Germans could not imagine. Cities that once produced cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods had been transformed into sprawling plants dedicated entirely to war production. Assembly lines ran around the clock. Every machine, every worker, and every engineer was focused on a single goal: to keep the bombers flying. Men who had never held a wrench before and women who had never operated heavy machinery were now skilled workers, learning quickly and producing aircraft with astonishing speed. The American workforce became a single, unified force, capable of replacing losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. The term, production miracle, was not an exaggeration. By 1943, the United States was producing hundreds of bombers each month, and the number was rising steadily. Factories like Boeing, Douglas, and Consolidated Aircraft became the beating heart of a program that Germany had assumed was slow, inefficient, and incapable of sustaining long-term combat. Every plane that fell in the skies over Europe was replaced, often with improvements in design and armament, creating a cycle the Germans could not break. The scale of this production was staggering. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, each a massive and complex machine, rolled off the assembly lines with precision and speed. Engines, bombs, navigational equipment, and machine guns were produced in parallel, ensuring that aircraft were combat-ready the moment they left the factory floor. Even when the Luftwaffe shot down dozens of bombers in a single raid, American factories had already built replacements for the next mission. The system was not just about quantity, it was about efficiency and adaptation. Production techniques were refined continuously. Lessons learned in one plant were quickly shared with others, ensuring that mistakes were not repeated. American managers introduced innovations in assembly line design, reducing construction time without sacrificing quality. In a matter of weeks, the United States could replace aircraft lost in combat with new machines that were often better armed, faster, or more resilient than their predecessors. For Germany, this reality was unimaginable. The German military had assumed that attrition would work in their favor, but now they faced an enemy whose production capacity seemed limitless. This industrial surge was supported by a workforce that reflected the nation's total commitment to victory. Women, long excluded from heavy industry, filled factories and became essential to the war effort. They learned to operate cranes, rivet fuselages, and test aircraft systems, often under the strictest quality control standards. Men who had been drafted or volunteered for the military supported the effort by working long shifts, maintaining machinery, and innovating new production techniques. Training programs were developed at unprecedented speed to ensure every worker could contribute to the aircraft output. Meanwhile, the U.S. government provided oversight, resources, and coordination, ensuring that no factory was idle and that supply chains for critical materials like aluminum, steel, and fuel remained intact. The result was a production machine that dwarfed the expectations of the German High Command. Hitler and his generals, still clinging to the belief that the Americans would falter, had no idea that the tide of bombers they faced would never cease. Every loss inflicted on the Americans was a temporary setback, quickly corrected by the relentless pace of production. By mid-1943, the numbers told a story that even German intelligence could not ignore. Hundreds of bombers were being built and deployed each month. Every time the Luftwaffe claimed victory, 2 more aircraft were already en route to Europe. Even seasoned German officers began to recognize a troubling pattern. No matter how many bombers were destroyed in battle, the sky never emptied. The American approach combined quantity with quality, producing aircraft that were durable, effective, and ready for combat at a pace that Germany could not match. It was an industrial tsunami that the Luftwaffe was powerless to stop. Hitler's mockery of American industry had turned into a strategic blunder of monumental proportions. The production miracle was not just a number on a chart, it was the force that would determine the air war over Europe. The Americans were learning, adapting, and growing stronger with every mission, and the Germans were caught in a cycle they could not escape. The bombing campaigns were no longer a series of isolated attacks. They had become the unstoppable wave of an industrially empowered nation, and Germany's skies were about to feel the full weight of it. By late 1943, the balance in the skies over Europe was beginning to shift. The initial confidence of the Luftwaffe, built on early victories and a belief in their superiority, started to erode. German pilots, once proud and invincible, were now facing an enemy that refused to be broken. Every bomber down was replaced within days, often with improved models and better trained crews. What had seemed like tactical successes now began to feel like a never-ending battle, one in which the Luftwaffe was being slowly consumed by attrition. Missions that once brought pride became exhausting trials of endurance. Pilots flew multiple sorties in a week, often facing the same bomber formations over and over, and the psychological toll began to show. Germany had a formidable air force, but even the best cannot fight indefinitely against an enemy that never stops coming. The turning point was not a single battle, but a pattern, a relentless rhythm of attack and replacement that the Germans could neither predict nor counter. Key raids such as those on Schweinfurt and Regensburg highlighted the emerging imbalance. In these missions, hundreds of bombers penetrated deep into German territory, facing the most elite German fighter units and intense anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe inflicted serious losses, and German reports celebrated these tactical victories. Yet the Americans adapted quickly, analyzing losses and adjusting formations, bombing routes, and timing to reduce future casualties. More importantly, the sheer volume of aircraft arriving in Europe meant that no German success could significantly dent the American effort. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the United States' capacity not just to produce aircraft, but to train crews, supply parts, and maintain operational readiness. Every mission the Germans won in the air was immediately followed by another, larger wave of bombers. German pilots began to realize that attrition was no longer a weapon they could wield. Instead, it was becoming a measure of their own vulnerability. The human cost on the German side was mounting at a terrifying rate. Experienced pilots, essential to the Luftwaffe's effectiveness, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Training new recruits could not match the pace of attrition in actual combat. By contrast, the Americans had developed an extensive training program for pilots and crews, ensuring that each bomber had a competent team ready to fly. The combination of production, training, and strategic planning meant that the American bombing campaigns were not only persistent but increasingly effective. German morale, once bolstered by initial victories, began to falter. High command faced the grim realization that the strategy of attrition, so central to Hitler's belief in German superiority, was failing against an industrially unstoppable adversary. Luftwaffe leaders warned of exhaustion and dwindling resources, but Hitler refused to adjust his expectations, continuing to demand perfection while the tide of American bombers grew stronger and more relentless. By the end of 1943, the turning point was unmistakable. German losses were mounting not just in numbers of aircraft, but in pilots, fuel, and essential supplies. Factories that had survived early bombing raids were now being targeted repeatedly, and the relentless pressure of American operations began to disrupt production schedules. Every German tactical success felt temporary, fleeting, and increasingly hollow. The Americans had mastered the art of endurance, combining quantity with evolving tactics and technological improvements. Bombers that survived one mission could return, regroup, and strike again, often hitting more targets with greater precision. The German command could no longer view the air war as a contest they could control. The early assumption that the U.S. would falter under losses had been decisively proven wrong. What had begun as a series of raids to test German defenses was now an unstoppable air offensive, driven by industrial power and strategic vision. Hitler's mockery of American industry had transformed into a nightmare he could not escape, and the turning point had arrived. Germany was being outproduced, outlasted, and slowly, inevitably ground down from the skies above. As 1944 approached, the reality of the American air offensive began to gnaw at Hitler and his generals with relentless pressure. What had been dismissed as minor raids now seemed like an unstoppable storm. Every week, hundreds of bombers reached German skies, carrying their payloads to factories, refineries, and cities. Every plane lost by the Americans was quickly replaced. Every tactical victory the Luftwaffe achieved was fleeting, vanishing in the face of production figures Germany could not match. Hitler, who had once mocked American industry as slow and incapable, now seethed with frustration. He could not comprehend how a nation he had long dismissed had transformed itself into a force capable of sustained, strategic bombing on a scale Germany could not resist. His anger was compounded by reports from his generals, who were increasingly aware that German air defenses were being stretched to their limits. The situation was becoming personal. It was no longer a question of strategy alone, but of pride, ego, and the illusion of invincibility crumbling under pressure. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, recounted the growing tension in the upper echelons of German command. Hitler's meetings became increasingly erratic, dominated by frustration over the endless flood of American bombers. He demanded miracle solutions, weapons that could instantly turn the tide of war, and punished officers who suggested the need to adjust strategy to the realities of production and attrition. The obsession with Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, was not mere fantasy. It was born from desperation. Rockets, jet aircraft, and experimental bombs were developed at extraordinary speed, often consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere. Hitler's belief that a single technological marvel could halt the bomber tide blinded him to the systemic problem. Germany was losing a war of production, endurance, and industrial capacity that could not be solved by any single weapon. His frustration was compounded by the fact that every decision seemed too little, too late. Factories were still churning out planes, and American crews, ever trained and disciplined, continued to strike with precision. On the front lines, Luftwaffe pilots felt the effects of this growing tension acutely. Orders became increasingly unrealistic, with high command demanding maximum results with dwindling fuel, spare parts, and experienced crews. Pilots who had flown hundreds of sorties over enemy territory now faced impossible odds. Exhaustion, fear, and frustration began to erode morale. Even the most skilled aces found themselves facing waves of bombers they could not stop, each mission reminding them that the enemy's strength was limitless in a way Germany could not match. Hitler, meanwhile, remained convinced that some decisive strike, some sudden breakthrough, would restore German dominance. He ignored reports highlighting the true scale of American production and underestimated the resilience of the U.S. bomber program. In his mind, victory still seemed within reach, but in reality, German strategy was collapsing under the weight of relentless American industrial output. The psychological dimension of Hitler's frustration was as significant as the strategic one. The endless waves of bombers were a constant reminder that his assumptions had been disastrously wrong. For the first time, Germany was facing an adversary whose power was measured not by skill in the air alone, but by the relentless capability to replace losses, innovate, and sustain pressure. Every failed interception, every missed target, and every bomber that slipped through defenses deepened Hitler's obsession with impossible solutions. The bomber offensive was no longer just a threat, it had become an insult to German pride, a testament to a nation underestimated a force that could outlast and outproduce the Reich at every turn. Hitler's frustration was more than anger. It was a harbinger of the desperation and irrational decisions that would mark the final months of the German war effort. The tide of bombers could not be stopped, and Germany's leaders were beginning to realize that their greatest enemy was not the planes themselves, but the industrial machine behind them, a machine that Hitler had mocked, and which was now proving unstoppable. By 1944, the consequences of underestimating American industrial power were painfully clear across the Reich. The relentless bombing campaigns were inflicting damage far beyond what German planners had anticipated. Factories that had once hummed with productivity were now reduced to rubble. Steel mills, aircraft plants, and oil refineries, the very lifeblood of Germany's war machine, were repeatedly targeted by waves of B-17s and B-24s. Each raid was more destructive than the last, leaving deep scars on Germany's industrial heartland. Cities were burned, transportation networks disrupted, and supply chains fractured. Every mission carried with it the knowledge that German production, already strained, was being stretched beyond its limits. The Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich was eroding, and the cost of every downed American bomber seemed increasingly negligible compared to the devastation inflicted upon Germany itself. This was a war not just of aircraft and pilots, but of infrastructure, industry, and endurance, a war Germany was increasingly losing. The human toll was equally staggering. Luftwaffe pilots, once confident and elite, were now exhausted and overextended. Many had flown dozens of missions in quick succession, facing waves of heavily armed bombers and fierce American fighter escorts. Losses among experienced airmen mounted, and the training pipeline could not replace them fast enough. New recruits, often barely ready for combat, were thrown into increasingly desperate missions with little chance of survival. Anti-aircraft crews faced continuous stress, their positions under constant threat, while civilians in targeted cities endured the terror of bombing raids, fires, and destruction of homes. Morale across the Reich began to crumble, as the realization sank in that no matter how many American bombers were shot down, the raids would continue. Every victory was temporary, every defensive success fleeting. The very fabric of German society was being strained under the weight of an enemy they could not stop, and the psychological impact was profound. Fear, fatigue, and hopelessness began to erode not just the effectiveness of the military, but the confidence of the entire nation. Industrial losses compounded the problem. Key production facilities for aircraft, tanks, and other war materials were repeatedly bombed, forcing Germany to allocate scarce resources for repair and relocation rather than new production. Oil refineries, essential for fueling the Luftwaffe and mechanized units, were targeted in precision raids, creating fuel shortages that grounded aircraft and immobilized vehicles. Train lines and supply depots, critical for moving resources and reinforcements, were destroyed, creating bottlenecks and logistical nightmares. The Germans were fighting not only in the skies but against an enemy that attacked the very foundations of their war effort. Every destroyed factory meant fewer replacements for lost planes, fewer engines, and fewer bombs to sustain their own attacks. The United States, by contrast, faced no such limitations. Every bomber downed over Germany was rapidly replaced, and the industrial engine of America continued to grow, producing more planes, engines, and trained crews with each passing month. The psychological effect on German leadership was profound. Hitler, Speer, and the generals could see the damage accumulating, yet the scale of the American industrial response seemed almost limitless. Every plan to defend the Reich was undermined by the constant flow of new bombers. Resources meant for offensive operations were diverted to defensive measures, and the Luftwaffe was forced into a reactive posture, always chasing, never controlling. Cities that had once been centers of production and pride were now shadows of their former selves, and civilian morale was beginning to fracture under the strain of repeated raids. The cost of underestimating American production was not measured in single battles or lost aircraft alone, it was a cascading, systemic collapse of the German war effort. Every loss Germany inflicted was mirrored and exceeded by the relentless resilience of the U.S. bomber program. The cost to Germany was total: men, machines, morale, and industry all being worn down in a war they could no longer hope to win. By late 1944, it became painfully clear that the tide could not be reversed. The relentless bomber campaign, backed by American industrial might, was breaking the German economy and military simultaneously. Factories lay in ruins, trained pilots were gone, fuel was scarce, and cities were reduced to rubble. The strategy that Germany had relied on, attrition, skill, and tactical prowess, was failing against an enemy whose strength was measured not by individual battles, but by an unending capacity to replace losses and strike again. The Americans had turned their production miracle into a weapon more powerful than any single aircraft, any fighter pilot, or any tactical maneuver. The cost to Germany was staggering, and the nation was beginning to feel the consequences of a war that it could no longer control. The tide of bombers never stopped coming, and Germany was paying the price in blood, steel, and fire. By 1944, The United States had fully demonstrated what the Germans had failed to anticipate. Industrial output alone was not enough. It was how that output was combined with strategy, training, and innovation that made the American bombing campaign unstoppable. The U.S. Army Air Forces had learned quickly from early raids, adapting tactics to minimize losses and maximize impact. Formation flying became more precise, allowing bombers to defend each other with concentrated firepower. Navigational techniques improved, enabling crews to hit critical industrial targets deep inside the Reich with greater accuracy. Fighter escorts, initially limited, evolved into long-range P-51 Mustangs that could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. These escorts dramatically reduced losses and increased the effectiveness of every mission. The Germans, despite their skill and experience, could not counter the combination of quantity, quality, and strategic innovation. Every victory they claimed in the air felt hollow because for every bomber they downed, 2 more were already on their way. The American advantage was also systemic. It extended beyond planes and pilots into a massive, coordinated war machine. Factories were not just producing aircraft, they were producing the parts, engines, fuel, and bombs necessary to keep them flying continuously. Training programs ensured that new crews could replace losses without reducing effectiveness. Intelligence and reconnaissance allowed for better mission planning, reducing surprises and optimizing target selection. Even logistical support, from supply chains to maintenance depots, was designed for efficiency and scale. In essence, the U.S. had created a self-sustaining loop: build, train, deploy, learn, and repeat. The Germans, by contrast, were forced into a reactive stance, trying desperately to patch defenses, retrain pilots, and repair factories while the American bomber tide continued unabated. The imbalance between offensive capability and defensive reaction became impossible to overcome. Strategically, the relentless pressure of American bombers began to shape the course of the war in ways the Germans could not contain. Key industrial centers, once thought safe, were repeatedly targeted and damaged, slowing tank and aircraft production and disrupting vital oil supplies. Railways and transportation hubs essential for moving troops and resources were continually bombed, straining the German war machine at every level. The Luftwaffe, while still formidable in tactical engagements, could not alter this strategic reality. Every tactical victory was overshadowed by the larger operational picture. The Americans could absorb losses, adapt tactics, and continue striking with ever-increasing intensity. German pilots were exhausted, cities were burning, and resources were dwindling. The advantage was no longer in experience or technology alone, it was in the scale, resilience, and strategic coordination of the American war effort. The psychological impact of this advantage was equally significant. For the Luftwaffe and the German High Command, it became clear that attrition was no longer a viable strategy. No matter how many bombers they shot down, the Americans kept coming. The perception of invincibility that had dominated German leadership now gave way to doubt, frustration, and desperation. Hitler's mockery of American industry, once a source of pride, had turned into disbelief. The United States had transformed its industrial capacity into a weapon of war that Germany could not match in quantity, quality, or adaptability. Every mission flown by the Americans reinforced the reality that victory in the air was determined not by a single battle or daring maneuver, but by the inexhaustible capacity to produce, deploy, and sustain an offensive that Germany could neither halt nor withstand. By combining innovation with relentless production, the Americans had effectively turned numbers into power, and persistence into dominance. The Luftwaffe, regardless of skill or technology, was being outlasted, outproduced, and strategically outmaneuvered. The skies over Germany were no longer a contest of individual engagements. They had become a test of endurance and industrial strength, and the United States had proven unstoppable. Each wave of bombers carried not just bombs, but the certainty that Germany's defenses, however formidable, could not withstand the combined weight of American ingenuity, resources, and sheer willpower. The advantage was overwhelming, undeniable, and irreversible. Hitler had mocked American industry, but it was now the instrument of his growing undoing. The relentless tide of bombers never stopped, and the consequences for Germany would be catastrophic. By 1945, the consequences of Hitler's mockery of American industry were undeniable. What had begun as arrogance, dismissing the United States as incapable of sustaining a major war effort, had transformed into a strategic nightmare for Germany. The relentless waves of bombers had shattered the illusion of control in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe, once considered supreme, was now stretched thin, struggling to defend a homeland under constant attack. German pilots, exhausted and outnumbered, faced an enemy whose strength was not measured by individual skill or bravery, but by the sheer scale and resilience of its production. Every B-17 or B-24 downed by German fighters was immediately replaced, often with improvements in design, armament, and crew efficiency. The Germans had failed to recognize that in a war of industry, endurance, and adaptability, attrition could no longer be the deciding factor. The Americans had mastered the art of relentless pressure, and Germany was paying the price. The psychological and material toll on Germany was immense. Cities lay in ruins, factories were destroyed or crippled, and vital resources like oil, steel, and trained pilots were in short supply. Every raid reinforced the truth the German High Command could not escape. They were losing a war not just in the air, but in production, logistics, and strategy. Hitler's obsession with miracle weapons, advanced aircraft, rockets, and experimental bombs could not reverse the tide. These efforts were costly, scattershot, and ultimately insufficient against a nation whose strength lay in sustained industrial output, innovative strategy, and relentless execution. The United States had turned factories, assembly lines, and human ingenuity into weapons of war more decisive than any single technological marvel. The bomber offensive was a testament to what a nation could achieve when every resource, every worker, and every strategy was focused on victory. Ultimately, the story of the American bombing campaign over Germany is one of miscalculation, endurance, and industrial might. Hitler had mocked the United States, confident that attrition would favor Germany, yet he underestimated the combination of American determination, innovation, and production capacity. The bombers kept coming, wave after wave, mission after mission, until Germany could no longer sustain its defenses. Every raid, every destroyed factory, and every exhausted pilot was a reminder that the Germans had failed to grasp the true scale of American power. The tide of bombers never stopped, and Germany's fate was sealed long before the final mission. In the end, it was not a single battle, a brilliant tactic, or even a technological breakthrough that won the air war. It was the relentless, unyielding force of American industry, producing, adapting, and striking with a certainty that Germany could not match. Hitler's mockery of American industry had become one of his greatest misjudgments. While the Luftwaffe fought valiantly, it was outlasted and outproduced. The skies over Germany told a story of inevitability, a nation that could replace its losses faster than they could be inflicted, a nation that turned production lines into a weapon more powerful than any aircraft, and a nation whose persistence and ingenuity ensured that the bomber offensive would never stop. The ultimate lesson is clear: in modern warfare, industrial strength and strategic endurance can outweigh arrogance, skill, and technological ambition. Hitler had underestimated the Americans, and in doing so, Germany had unleashed a chain of events that would contribute decisively to its downfall. The skies over Europe were forever changed, not by a single weapon, but by a nation's capacity to build, endure, and strike without pause.